right, so today we're diving into one of the most complex and volatile situations, honestly, in the world.
Yeah.
The future of Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
Right.
Even with a ceasefire right now in place, it really feels like we're all just standing on a powder keg.
I think that's a pretty apt analogy.
Yeah.
We're looking at a fragile ceasefire that we started on January 19th of this year,
Fair reason.
just about a month ago,
Yeah.
following a conflict that resulted in over 1,200 Israeli deaths and tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties.
It's hard to even fathom that human cost,
Yeah.
and even harder to imagine what a path towards peace would even look like at this point.
Well, it's crucial to remember that Hamas has governed Gaza since 2007.
Okay.
And their perspective is shaped by years of Israeli blockades and the ongoing struggle for Palestinian statehood.
Right.
And from their viewpoint, this was a strategic move, a calculated move aimed at breaking the status quo and forcing the international community to pay attention to their grievances.
We're facing this humanitarian crisis in Gaza that seems almost insurmountable.
Yeah, the devastation is really staggering.
Yeah.
Hospitals, schools, water and sanitation systems.
Essential infrastructure.
All the essentials of a functioning society are just in ruins.
Yep.
And millions of displaced Gazans are just struggling to access basic needs like food, water, medical supplies.
We've heard about those aid convoys, over 12,600 trucks since the ceasefire started.
Right.
Can those even come close to addressing the long-term damage that's been inflicted?
I mean, any humanitarian aid is a positive step, but in reality, it's just a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Right.
The rebuilding process is going to require a massive coordinated effort.
Yeah.
And even then, the psychological scars of this conflict are going to linger for generations.
And let's not forget, this ceasefire is barely holding on.
Right.
Okay.
You know, Hamas wants a comprehensive prisoner exchange in return for a permanent truce, and Israel demanding a complete Hamas withdrawal from Gaza and full disarmament.
So before they even talk about any of that.
Before any negotiations can take place.
Wow. So we're at a stalemate?
Essentially, yes.
But with so much at stake.
Right.
Neither side can afford to just walk away, can they?
No, they can't.
No.
The pressure is immense, both domestically and internationally, to find some sort of resolution.
Yeah.
But navigating this political minefield with all the mistrust and the conflicting demands is going to require extraordinary diplomatic skill and a willingness to compromise.
And while all that's going on, the clock is ticking.
Yes, it is.
The second phase of this ceasefire that's supposed to address all the really difficult issues.
Yeah.
The prisoner exchanges, a potential Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
Right.
It's stalled before it's even begun.
That's right. And this delay is making the humanitarian crisis even worse.
Right.
And that creates a vicious cycle where the lack of progress just fuels desperation and increases the risk of another violent eruption.
It's like this heartbreaking paradox.
Yeah.
A ceasefire is in place, but the threat of violence is just looming larger than ever.
Well, that's the tragic reality of this conflict, this constant balancing act, trying to find an equilibrium in a region that's always teetering on the brink.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not just a localized issue. You know, what happens between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, it has ripple effects throughout the entire region and the world.
Right.
You can't ignore the geopolitical dimensions at play.
So let's zoom out a bit.
Okay.
What are some of the key external factors that are influencing this situation?
Right.
I know there's a lot of talk about Iran's involvement.
Sure, Iran's support for Hamas is definitely a factor.
Yeah.
But it's often oversimplified, I think.
Okay.
It's more about shared interests than it is about direct control.
Okay.
Iran sees Hamas as a way to exert influence in the region and challenge Israel.
Right.
But they're not necessarily calling all the shots.
So it's this complex web of alliances and rivalries.
Exactly.
What about other regional players like Egypt and Jordan?
Well, they're walking a tightrope.
Okay.
Both countries have peace treaties with Israel, but they also have significant Palestinian populations.
Right.
So they can't ignore the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza.
Right.
Their influence could be really crucial in mediating negotiations and pushing for a more sustainable solution.
And of course, we can't forget the U.S., Israel's most powerful ally.
Right. Well, the U.S. has been unwavering in its support for Israel's security, but there's also pressure on them to do more to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and push for a political solution that respects Palestinian rights.
Right. It's like this delicate balancing act for them.
It is a delicate balancing act.
And the outcome of the upcoming U.S. elections could really shift the dynamics.
It could, yeah.
So we've got all these external players with their own agendas and their own interests.
Right.
It's almost like this high-stakes game of chess, where every move has the potential to upend the whole board.
That's a good way to visualize it.
Yeah,
And we can't forget the internal divisions within both Israel and Hamas.
right.
In Israel, there's a strong debate going on between those who favor a hardline approach and those who see negotiation as the only path forward.
Yeah.
And then within Hamas, you have different factions with varying levels of influence and willingness to compromise.
And that internal fragmentation just makes it so much harder to find any common ground.
It does.
I mean, it's hard enough to negotiate when you're dealing with a united front,
Right.
let alone a group that has competing internal agendas.
Exactly, and that's why understanding these internal dynamics is so crucial to assessing the potential for progress.
Okay.
You know, we can't just assume that Hamas or Israel speaks with one voice.
Right.
There are nuances and complexities within each side that we have to consider.
There have been some pretty radical proposals thrown around,
Yeah.
like former President Trump's idea to relocate Gaza's population.
Right.
Is that even remotely feasible?
It's highly unlikely. And honestly, it raised a lot of eyebrows, even among those sympathetic to Israel's security concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Relocating millions of people would just be logistically nightmarish.
Yeah,
Not to mention the ethical and legal implications.
right. And it just completely ignores the Palestinian right of return, which is like a cornerstone of their demand.
It does, yeah.
But let's be realistic here. Given all of these obstacles,
Sure.
the entrenched positions, the geopolitical pressures, the internal divisions, is there even a glimmer of hope for a lasting peace?
That's the question that keeps me up at night. And
Yeah.
honestly, the path forward is really murky at best.
Yeah.
The current trajectory with the sporadic violence and this fragile ceasefire that's always on the verge of collapse.
Right.
It's just not sustainable.
Right.
But I will say, amidst the despair, there are also some flickers of possibility.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of possibilities?
Well, for starters, the fact that both sides actually agreed to this ceasefire, however tenuous it is, suggests that neither side actually wants a full-blown war.
Right.
There's a recognition, even among the hardliners, that the costs of another major conflict would be catastrophic.
So at least there's a shared understanding of the potential consequences,
Yeah.
but that doesn't necessarily translate into a willingness to compromise, does it?
No, it doesn't.
No.
But it does create a window of opportunity, however slim it might be.
Okay.
And that's where I think the international community can play a really crucial role.
So you're talking about like mediation efforts, diplomatic pressure, things like that.
Right, exactly.
But haven't we seen countless rounds of negotiations fail in the past?
We have.
So what makes this time any different?
You're right, the track record isn't exactly encouraging.
Right.
But I do think there are a few key factors that could shift the equation.
Okay.
Firstly, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached a critical point. The international community can't ignore the suffering of millions of people.
So the sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster could force some action.
I think there's a possibility of that, yeah.
Okay.
And secondly, the regional landscape has changed.
Okay.
The Abraham Accords, for example.
Right.
They've created new alliances and shifted the geopolitical calculus in the Middle East.
Okay.
And this could open up new avenues for dialogue and cooperation that weren't there before.
So there's potential for these new alliances to actually play a constructive role.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay.
But it's still very early, and it's important not to overstate their impact.
Right.
The fundamental issues that have fueled this conflict for decades, they remain unresolved.
Right.
And it feels like we're at a crossroads, you know?
Yeah.
A fragile ceasefire that's barely holding things together, but so much uncertainty about the future.
So is there any scenario where we could see a genuine breakthrough, like a real shift towards a more lasting peace?
It's not impossible, but it would require a fundamental change in mindset on both sides.
Okay.
A willingness to move beyond this zero-sum game mentality.
So moving away from the idea that one side can only win at the expense of the other,
Exactly.
which is easier said than done,
Much easier said than done, yeah.
especially after decades of mistrust and violence.
Absolutely. It would take a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
A recognition that true security for both Israelis and Palestinians can only come through mutual understanding and cooperation.
How do you even begin to build that kind of trust, though?
Right.
I mean, the wounds are so deep.
Well, it starts with small steps, gestures of goodwill, confidence-building measures,
Okay.
a willingness to engage in dialogue without preconditions.
So creating spaces where Israelis and Palestinians can actually interact on a human level
Exactly.
outside the framework of political negotiations.
Right. Outside the framework of political negotiations.
You're talking about people-to-people diplomacy,
Yeah,
cultural exchanges, things like that.
exactly. Initiatives that foster empathy and understanding.
Okay.
that break down stereotypes and challenge those narratives of fear and hatred that have taken root on both sides.
It sounds almost idealistic.
It does.
But I suppose even the most intractable conflicts have to start somewhere.
They do, and we can't forget the role of the international community either.
Right.
They can provide the support, the diplomatic pressure, the financial incentives
Okay.
to really encourage both sides to take those initial steps towards reconciliation.
So it's not just about Israelis and Palestinians talking to each other.
Right.
It's about engaging the broader international community as well.
It is, absolutely.
It requires that multifaceted approach.
It does.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listener to think about?
Okay, well, I think the most crucial takeaway is that the future of Israel and Hamas in Gaza is not preordained.
Okay.
It's not a foregone conclusion that this cycle of violence will continue indefinitely.
Okay.
There are alternative paths. There are possibilities for a more peaceful future.
But those require a conscious effort,
Yes,
right?
do.
A willingness to actually challenge the status quo.
And a commitment to building a shared vision of hope.
A vision that seems pretty distant right now,
It does.
but one that's worth striving for.
Absolutely. It starts with understanding these complexities, engaging in constructive dialogue, and recognizing that even small actions can contribute to a larger movement for peace.
That's a powerful message, and I think it gives us all reason to be cautiously optimistic, even in the face of such a challenging situation.
I agree.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here.
Right?
This is an issue that demands our continued attention, our critical thinking, and our active engagement.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to delve deeper into this topic.
Yes.
Explore the resources that are available, challenge your own assumptions, and contribute to the ongoing dialogue about how to build a more peaceful and just future for everyone involved.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.